Hello, my name is Justin Stairs. This is the Brussels Signal Studio, and we're going to be doing a remote interview today. I'm very happy to have Professor Florian Bieber on the line. He's Professor of Political Science and History at the University of Graz and is normally based in Austria. Hello there, Professor. Thank you again for finding some time.
Hello, good to talk to you.
Now, we have become familiar with you here on the Brussels Signal, in particular because you've been working with one of our reporters on a particular story, and that story connects Serbia with a mining issue, a lithium mine. Okay. So can you, to start out, Professor, how come you're specialized in the Balkans? What's your backstory, please?
Well, I studied in Austria, and this was in the 90s during the Yugoslav wars, and the kind of conflicts aroused my curiosity, and I was trying to learn more about them. And well, this is now a quarter century later, and the Balkans have not left me alone, and I've been spending several years living in Sarajevo, in Belgrade, among other places. So this has been a topic which has been part of my academic and personal curiosity and focus for a quarter century now, in fact.
Okay. Well, let's start off then with Serbia, because there is a current issue regarding this lithium mine. And the story we wrote centered on the fact that sometimes EU enlargement negotiations, Serbia is, in theory, set to join the European Union. Sometimes these negotiations can find themselves at a delicate point in that the EU, Brussels, is supposed to be spreading democracy and its values throughout the Balkan region, whereas at the same time, in this particular case, seeking to secure access to essential metals. Is that the point we're at today?
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think what we could say to that is that the enlargement process when it comes to Serbia has been stalling. Well, formally speaking, Serbia, together with Montenegro, is a country which is the most advanced down the road towards EU membership in the Western Balkans in terms of the formal steps. The process is really stagnating for years. There hasn't been much progress made in terms of the negotiations. And in fact, Serbia has been backsliding when it comes to all of the important criteria which are essential, as you mentioned, democracy and rule of law. There's been, in fact, not progress, but rather regression in Serbia. Now, here comes in this project, this mining project, which is seen as essential for the European Union to create a electronic car industry independent of China, with lithium as an essential ingredient. And this project is receiving explicit support. There was a letter of commitment signed and an agreement signed a few weeks ago in Belgrade by the responsible EU commissioner and the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. So we can see that there's a very strong commitment to this project from the EU side, and there are serious questions over whether this project actually undermines the European future of Serbia down the road.
So just let me start off with a few basic facts. In terms of the accession negotiations, is there a timeline for Serbia?
Well, I mean, there's no timeline for anybody in a realistic sense. I mean, dates have been thrown around over the last years, but nobody has really made a commitment to a date. There have been several clusters have been opened, and negotiations have been ongoing for basically a decade now with Serbia. But there is no progress. And I think this is something which even the European Commission reports clearly underscore, that there is not really substantial movements on key issues. And this is in a sort of way the formal aspect of it. And then on the other side, all major international observers, be it international organizations like ODIHR during elections, as well as NGOs like Freedom House, note how democracy in Serbia has gotten weaker, how it's become increasingly authoritarian. And of course, this is a precondition. You cannot join the European Union if you do not have a functioning rule of law, if you have a captured state, and if you have a very flawed democracy. So in that sense, timeline is not even a realistic topic for Serbia at the moment, considering that it's really regressing rather than moving towards EU membership.
Okay, so at the same time, the European Union would like access to this lithium mine, correct?
Indeed, I mean, and it's this lithium mine, of course, project is one plan carried out by Rio Tinto, which is a multinational conglomerate, but one which is seen as being willing to, in a certain way, provide and supply the lithium mine in Serbia to European producers who will need it. And this is for the European Union part of its kind of strategic attempt to provide it with the raw metals, with the rare metals it needs.
De-risking from other states such as China is all part of this plan, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's this nearshoring idea that you can that you can create these products on the European continent. There are also in the EU some lithium deposits, but the one in Serbia appears to be a large one. It's of course in a country which is very close to the European Union, a few hundred kilometers. The mine is a few hundred kilometers from the EU's external borders. So all of that would provide the presumed benefits of creating a supply for European producers, especially, I mean, people are thinking of German car makers. I mean, this is one of the reasons why Germany seems to have been quite instrumental in supporting this project.
Right. Okay. So, what essentially is the problem? Because I guess couldn't you separate the two issues out? I mean, there is a lithium mine which the EU would like to get access to. They could do a deal there. I presume a deal has been done. And on the other hand, there is EU enlargement with obstacles on the road that you've just mentioned. Why do you have to link the two issues? Why should one link the two issues?
Well, the EU cannot, not claim to be completely, a different character for a different type of engagement in Serbia. So the EU can't say to join the EU, you need to fulfill democracy and rule of law. And for this other project, we're not going to care about that. I mean, this is a rather schizophrenic approach. The problem is really that it's not the mine project as such, but it's rather the context. So let me lay out a few parts of this context. When the project was first announced in 2020, within a year, you had massive protests in Serbia, some of the biggest protests seen to that date. They were throughout the whole country. There was some violence by thugs against those protesters. There was this clear indication that they were linked to the ruling party. But nevertheless, after those protests continued, the government stopped the project of the mine, claiming that they're doing it in regard to respecting the popular opinion. Now, the reason seemed to have been primarily because there was an election planned, and they wanted to make sure that the ruling party is not losing support over this issue. But already at that time, so 2 years ago roughly, the president said that I'm the most stupid president in the world for having stopped this project. So the kind of signal was, we don't really like the idea that we stop this lithium project. But so what is very clear is that this project meets a lot of resistance from the population, and the government made very little effort to explain it to its own citizens. So this is where, of course, it starts undermining the EU's talk about enlargement as a process which supports rule of law and democracy. There's no consultation in Serbia, which one would expect for such a large mining project. There is a lot of intransparency about where the money will go, who will benefit from it. We know about the resource curse, the idea that raw materials, which bring in a lot of money to governments in a kind of authoritarian state capture context, often does not benefit the citizens, but actually benefits those in power and entrench those power structures. And this is a real worry, that this mining project will in fact entrench those in power and not help democracy in Serbia. And then finally, there's a serious concern about the environmental implications of this project. And in a country where past projects, past investments have often flagrantly violated Serbia's own environmental legislation with the backing of the government, because it sees that the investments are more interesting than its own legal framework. There's a serious concern that this mining project, which, as far as I know, and I'm not an expert on mining, but reading the reports of the experts, is one which potentially has a large damage on a relatively substantial part of Serbian territory in terms of agricultural lands, in terms of groundwater, in terms of pollution. And there we have a government which has been violating its own environmental standards. There's a real risk that we're going to see a major environmental impact. So all of that together, added to the fact that the Serbian government is getting explicit support of the European Union on this project, kind of undermines the claim that EU enlargement process is about democracy and rule of law, because the EU, through the support for this project, actually undermines all of them. And thus, the promise of EU integration and the promise that it's about a merit-based process is undermined by the institution which is promoting this process itself. And this is really the problem. The EU cannot speak with two separate voices in one country in such a way without losing a lot of its own credibility.
Okay, and the protests that have taken place in Serbia, are they largely environmental protests?
Yes, I mean there were environmental protests. Now, of course, you can't separate environmental protests from protests against the government, because the problem is really that there's a lot of distrust in the government. There have been nonstop protests, for the last 7 or 8 years in Serbia. Every year there have been major protests against the government, always around different issues. So last year there was a major wave of protests over a school shooting and another mass shooting outside of Belgrade, where many citizens felt the government wasn't responding adequately. It had been promoting a kind of culture of violence in the public sphere. So again, there are many issues, including environmental issues, which bring people to the street. They often see the government as being ultimately responsible. And so in a certain way, I would say, yes, it's environmental, but it also sees the government as not a reliable actor. It doesn't trust the government because the government has been seen as being kind of unreliable. And you can, with this whole project, now we're seeing new protests in Serbia against the Rio Tinto mining project, because the whole thing happened very quickly. There were some indications earlier this year that the mining project would restart, but then there was a decision of the Constitutional Court which annulled the earlier stoppage in early July. A few days later, the government gives a green light for the project to restart. And a couple of days later, the EU, the German Chancellor, and the Serbian government signed this new deal. This all happened within a week. So this was clearly designed to, in a certain way, bypass public opinion, especially taking place in July when people are getting ready for the summer holidays. So, there's a sense of distrust in the government because it seems to be doing things, on the sneak, so to speak.
Okay, and so obviously the elephant in the room, Serbia is traditionally a pro-Russia country, or at least they have tight economic, cultural links. And therefore, the position of Brussels, the European Union, is obviously a very delicate one within Serbia. Are you hinting at this kind of problem, or should it be said explicitly? Is this the reason why relations are so complex?
It is certainly part of the complexity of relations between the EU and Serbia. I mean, it goes even beyond Russia. Serbia, under the current president, Vučić, has been systematically cultivating good relations also with China. Part of that, as well as other actors, major investments from the United Arab Emirates, good economic ties with Turkey, all of that has been really built up to reduce the influence of the European Union on Serbia. Now, some of this EU support for this mining project is seen as an attempt to, in a certain way, link Serbia economically closer to the European Union and try to kind of woo it away from other international actors. However, that's misunderstanding the current regime. Well, I wouldn't say it's pro-Russian. It's a pro-Serbian regime which uses all historical narratives and myths all its international ties to basically maneuver in this kind of current geopolitical climate for maximum independence, but one which serves the ruling elite, the ruling government, not very much the citizens. So in a certain way, it's about maximizing maneuvering space and avoiding the conditions which EU enlargement process requires. So EU enlargement requires, that you beef up your environmental standards, your labor rights, and so on. And this is something which the Serbian government clearly is not interested in. And thus it brings in these other actors to, you could say, muddy the waters, increase its own bargaining space. And this, of course, makes this relationship more complicated. And the current government is using this also as a leverage with the European Union to say, well, if you don't support us on this project, we'll find another investor. And Serbia has been hinting that maybe that mining project could be taking place with Chinese or other investors instead of a more Australian British conglomerate, a multinational like Rio Tinto.
So, but it seems from what you're saying as if the accession negotiations are going nowhere anyway. With the current Serbian regime, there's little chance of Serbia joining the EU in the near future. Is that fair?
Yes, I think with the current Serbian government, there's no realistic chance of Serbia joining. I mean, it's been in power for 12 years. There's no indication it's going to change its track record. And so it is rather becoming more authoritarian than less. So I think the door for Serbia with the current government is closed. Now, I think this has to be considered in the light of the fact that there have been these massive citizens protests over the years, and there are many citizens who are deeply dissatisfied with the current government. But what is happening now is with the EU support for this mining project that people say, well, the EU is also supporting him. So basically, whom do we turn to in trying to, offer an alternative? And this is in a certain way the problem. He has already allies in Russia and in China. And if he also has them in the European Union, there's a sense of, well, we're kind of left alone. And this, in the short term, one could say, well, Serbia is anyhow not going to join the European Union, so you might as well make a deal. In the medium term and the long term, it basically means you're pushing citizens away from the European Union. You're creating an image of the EU as being just another deal maker, just like China or Russia, disregarding environmental and labor rights. And as a result, it really kind of burns a lot of bridges, which I think has a very negative long-term, implications.
Okay. So what you're saying basically is in these talks with Serbia, issues such as rule of law are being pushed right down the agenda, and right at the top, you have the EU's desire for access to lithium. In this case, this is essentially your point. Now, okay, but surely. I'm going to play a bit of devil's advocate here. Surely the European Union is desperate for access not only to lithium, even to energy, for example. We've been running stories here on the Brussels Signal about the continued imports into the European Union of energy from Russia, LNG, the liquefied natural gas in particular. We ran a story just yesterday saying that France, for example, has increased its imports of Russian LNG by a large factor, a double-digit growth this year only. And so there are many examples of countries with whom the European Union deals where there is no democracy at all, or flawed democracies. I mean, this is one of the realities of trade, isn't it? If you decide that you're only going to trade with countries where the democratic record is perfect, you'd quickly find yourself with very few trading partners at all, wouldn't you? So why should Serbia be any different?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, of course, that, one is, EU is trading a lot with China. China is certainly far away from being a democracy. No, I think the issue here really is that there was a different promise made. I mean, Serbia was presented together with the other Western Balkan countries to have a future in the European Union. And this is a different type of relationship than one with a country where that promise was never made. And so this is, I think, really crucial. Relations become different between the EU and an accession country than between the EU and any third country. There's a contractual relationship, there's a promise, there's a political process, there's a legal process. All of that makes that relationship fundamentally different than, say, between the EU and Saudi Arabia or Russia or China or any other country with whom one does business. And it's not just about Serbia, because it does send a negative message to all of the other countries, neighboring countries. So, Serbia is not the only country in the enlargement process. We have 10 countries altogether, and in the Western Balkans altogether, 6. All of those 6 countries, or 5 besides Serbia, will look and say, well, in fact, if we're trying to reform, if we're making a real effort, we're going to get less benefits than if we're basically just looking for a good deal with the European Union. So it undermines the message of the EU throughout those countries. And I think what we have to bring in here is that the whole promise of EU enlargement was not done out of, just kind of charity, but it was done for a strategic interest, that the best way to ensure political, geopolitical stability in the Western Balkans is through their EU integration. I mean, we're talking about countries which fought wars 25 years ago, where lots of these issues are still at least simmering, where lots of them are not fully resolved, where there are plenty of political actors who would like to revise borders, who would be willing to risk new conflicts. And 25 years ago, when the wars came to an end, the real idea was, well, if we offer them this EU perspective, if we bring them in, we link them in the European Union and in NATO, we prevent the reoccurrence of wars and instability. And if that is thrown overboard for lithium, then I think the cost might be much greater down the road. So I think this is what we have to be aware of, is that there's a trade-off between short-term benefits from this mine. I mean, short-term, we're talking about not short-term immediate, but like a few years down the road, to the kind of potential damage this project, and it's part of a larger package of EU neglect in the Western Balkans, brings in 10 years. And then the cost might be much greater than the lithium mine in Serbia.
Okay, so what you're saying is, if the EU supports this lithium mine project, the message it is sending out will in some way come back to bite the EU in the rear end. Is that what you're saying? In that if the EU is seen to support certain, you say, authoritarian governments, then the people might be put off the whole process. Is that what you're saying, essentially?
Indeed, the people, the neighboring governments. We also have to keep in mind that Serbia is not just authoritarian, it's been meddling in the affairs of neighboring countries. It's been undermining the independence of Kosovo, which it doesn't recognize. It's been pushing its own agenda in Montenegro, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and to some extent even North Macedonia. So in that sense, we're having an actor who regionally is a bully in many ways under the current government, and creating more problems than anybody else. And that is certainly not an actor you want to reward and encourage in basically wreaking more havoc in the region. So I think this is really what we're talking about. It's an autocrat internally, and one which is promoting kind of nationalist revisionism externally. And that's not really what you want to promote. And I really fear that the cost for the EU, and not to mention for the citizens of the countries, will be way greater than the benefits from this mine.
Now, just to get a few facts straight, the European Union recognizes the Serbian government. We don't have a Venezuela issue here, do we?
No, I mean, we have a government which has been elected. I mean, the elections were neither free nor fair. But yes, there is no issue over that. The president
You say neither free nor fair. Is that your opinion, or is it that the opinion of the European Commission?
Well, I mean, if you look at the reports of ODIHR, which is the election monitoring body, they have noticed a lot of irregularities, very substantial irregularities during the election process. We also have, and this is noted by both election observers as well as people who observe the media landscape, none of them consider the media landscape to be independent. I mean, the state broadcaster, as well as all of the national television stations with a countrywide frequency, all of them are supporting the president unconditionally and giving no space to opposition candidates of any substance. So this is the environment we're talking about, and this is not my.
But nevertheless, though, I mean, in terms of the latest election results, they were recognized across Europe, correct?
Yes, the election results were recognized.
So it's a legitimate government in the eyes of the rest of the EU.
That is correct, yes.
Right, okay. Okay. In terms of briefly the rest of the Balkans, if we could, and the EU enlargement, which country is closest to join?
Well, I think we have really kind of two groups in the region. I mean, we have six countries. We have Montenegro, Albania, and North Macedonia, countries which probably are could have the easiest path to EU membership because they have no large, substantial issues with their neighbors which could block them. I would say the furthest down the road is Montenegro. It's the smallest country of the region. It's been negotiating longer than Serbia, and it doesn't have many issues. So that country could probably join by 2030 if the government really made all the efforts necessary. Albania and North Macedonia could be next. North Macedonia has still been blocked by an issue with Bulgaria, but that is a bit of a kind of a frivolous issue, one could say. But other than that, it could move relatively fast. The three countries which will have the hardest time are, besides Serbia, for the reasons we've already discussed, Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo. Kosovo is not recognized by 5 EU member states. Bosnia-Herzegovina is struggling with the fact that it's internally deeply divided and a very fragile government with very weak institutions. So I would say it's kind of three could make it, maybe starting at the end of this decade, and the other three will struggle probably for a while longer.
And you mentioned there that it obviously is difficult, if not impossible, for the European Union to enlarge to countries which have problems with neighbors. This used to be one of the key issues of enlargement: sort out your problems before you join. But nevertheless, Ukraine is on the way to joining, or at least negotiations are taking place. Cyprus still is a divided island, and nevertheless an EU member. I'm wondering if this is a big issue or not. I know there's been a lot of talk about this issue in the past, but surely reality shows that this is no longer really a deal breaker.
Well, it depends on which neighbor. I mean, it's a problem if the neighbor is an EU country, because then the EU country can wield a veto. And this is really the problem in some of the cases. We've had North Macedonia blocked for years by Greece because Greece objected to the name Macedonia at the time. And then in recent years, we've had, we had the French veto against Albania and North Macedonia for a year. And then we had the Bulgarian blockage because Bulgaria has questions about North Macedonia and its own language and identity. So this is the issue. Like bilateral disputes matter. It matters depending on with whom those disputes are. If they are with a third country, then one can ignore them. Cyprus, let's say, but if they are with an EU member state, then that EU member state has all the leverage to stop the process. And this is what we've seen. In fact, the abuse of these veto rights for settling bilateral issues in a certain way, in a very asymmetric situation. So that is really the key distinction I would draw. And also you could say that the Cyprus experience is one which I would say that a lot of EU member states don't want to repeat. So Cyprus also managed to get in because there was substantial Greek pressure at the time to disregard the fact that it did not unify and it did not accept the Annan plan at the time on the majority Greek part of the island. So again, I wouldn't draw the conclusion that bilateral issues are not a deal breaker at the moment.
Right. Okay. Fair point. And in terms of public sentiment, is there any? And let's go back to Serbia. Is there any reliable data on the desire of the Serbians to join the European Union?
Yes, I would say there are plenty of surveys, and they indicate that in Serbia there's no longer a majority for joining the European Union. In all the other countries of the region, there is a very strong majority, between 70 and 90%, in support of joining the European Union. In Serbia, it's below 50%, quite consistently over the last few years. I would say that number has dropped over the last 15 years. Quite clearly. It used to be at 70%. And that drop is very much part of the media landscape. If you look at the media and the tabloid headlines, there's nearly not a day in which there isn't an anti-Western story. The West, the CIA, the Germans, whoever else is blamed for some anti-Serbian attitude. So, of course, the Serbian attitudes or critical attitudes towards the European Union is to a large extent the product of a government which has been systematically promoting an anti-Western narrative in the public sphere. This is, again, an exception in the region. What the problem is, what we're having elsewhere in the Western Balkans, is that citizens are not becoming anti-European, but they just don't believe it's going to happen. So if you ask people, when do you think you're going to join? The share of those who believe it will happen never or in the far future has been steadily increasing in recent years. And that, of course, is equally disempowering because citizens just don't believe it anymore. And then if you don't believe it anymore, you're not going to make your election choices based on that. And you're not going to, in a certain way, hold your leaders accountable because you're just anyhow kind of given up hope in this project. And that, of course,
That sort
is
of disillusionment, essentially, they're disillusioned. Okay,
exactly.
final question then, or final point at least. It's interesting to hear what you said about the role of the media in Serbia. You seem to believe that the media creates public sentiment, or at least has a very large influence on public sentiment, though at the same time, I presume the Serbians have access to internet. They're all on social media like everyone and everywhere else. So can you be sure that it is the media that is creating this resentment among the Serbians, or are there other factors?
Well, I mean, it's media is of course, it's also on the social media. I mean, very, of course, if you want to be informed in Serbia, you can have access to all, social, and media informations from around the world. But who really does that? I mean, most people consume their own, in a certain way, national bubbles, language-wise, and so on. And so that is very much anti-Western. And if you look in Serbia, there's just it's through the speeches of politicians, it's the media, it's everywhere around you is a very persistent anti-Western image. Now, of course, it draws on past experience, which is not created by the media. The wars of the 1990s. In Serbia are generally seen as being just wars in many ways by many Serbs. There's no reckoning with the past. And in fact, when it's often what you find in the media is picking up on that theme and saying, well, the West was anti-Serbian in the 1990s. This is something which was the strong line of the regime of Slobodan Milosevic. The West was supporting all the others. And that is picked up upon. So in a certain way, it's not that the media are kind of conjuring up this image out of the thin air. They're building on pre-existing stereotypes and views, but they're reinforcing them every day over and over, including in social media and elsewhere. And then that becomes mutually reinforcing. So you can break out of it if you want to, but if you look at the headlines, I mean, there's somebody counted that per year there have been over 300 wars which are allegedly threatening Serbia in Serbian media. So, it's kind of, you're constantly surrounded by an environment which tells you that you're permanently under threat of war. And some people have likened this kind of paranoid atmosphere created to a similar kind of media atmosphere environment which people in Russia have been subjected to at least in the years before well, now of course even more, but in the years before the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So in a certain way, you can create this image if you have a fairly dominant government which really promotes it through all of its media channels, including social media.
That's great. That's been very interesting. Professor Florian Bieber, many thanks for spending half an hour with us this morning. And well, maybe we can talk again.
My pleasure.
And thank you very much for watching.